Hello, everybody, and welcome to our YouTube series on the five senses. We are pairing this with the audio podcast episodes on the senses from Overthink, and you can check those out on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to your podcasts, or also here on YouTube. I am your co-host, Dr. Ellie Anderson, and over to you, David, for
Well,
to introduce our speaker.
hi everyone. This is David, Ellie's sidekick, the other co-host of Overthink. And yeah, we are really excited to have with us today Matthew Fulkerson, who is associate professor of philosophy at the University of California, San Diego, where he also works in the interdisciplinary program in cognitive science. And he is the author of The First Sense, a philosophical study of human touch, as well as a number of articles on perception, emotion, and the senses. And he is here to talk to us today about what some people consider to be the fundamental sense, which is touch.
Spoiler
Matthew,
alert, he thinks
yeah.
so. Hence the book title, The First Sense.
Yes. And Matthew, thank you for being with us. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about touch and perception generally. I think it's a great thing to be here.
Great.
Wonderful. So we are going to just dive right into your research, because one of the things that's really great about your book is that in some ways, common conceptions of the senses consider the senses as capacities for receiving sensory information, as though all the senses were just passive receptacles for material coming in from the outside. But you show that touch in particular reveals how the senses are not passive. You emphasize that touch is crucial for what you call exploratory action. And you use the example of fumbling, like reaching in your bag and fumbling around in order to try to find a set of keys, which is something that we do through touch. We use touch to identify the right key within the key ring, to differentiate the key ring from other things. And so we explore the contents through tactile sensations. And so the first question that I have for you is, how does exploratory action work in the case of touch? And how does it show that touch is not, in fact, passive?
That's a great question, and it connects to so many different things that are going on when we're doing work in perception. So one of the things that was a challenge when I first started as a graduate student was the so-called visuocentrism of philosophy of mind, where philosophers would always have these examples where the example always is, I was in a room looking at a red apple on a table. It's always like this red apple in good light. And you're just, it's a passive scenario where you're sitting there looking at this apple and it's just sitting there and there's distance between you and it, and you're not engaging with it. You're not moving around the room. You're not doing any of the things that you would normally do. And then so philosophers and also this is true, also psychologists would very often wonder, what the shape consists in and how we get the object recovered from the 2D image on the retina and all these other kinds of questions. And when you start looking at touch, you realize that that model is not going to work at all, because that kind of passive reception just doesn't apply. If you want to know what the apple is like, you've got to reach out and touch it. And when you do touch it, you're going to do so in a lot of different ways. You might tap it, you might hold it in your hand, you might shake your hand to see if it's heavy, you might run your hand across it to see if it's smooth, you want to know its temperature. So touch is active and it involves this kind of engaged motor activity, but it also involves a range of different kinds of properties. And these different properties each require different kinds of actions. So if you want to find out if something's solid, you got to tap it. And that's a very different action from finding out if it's warm or cold or smooth. And so psychologists have, sort of come up with this set of constrained exploratory activities that guide how we interact through touch. And when we start thinking about these kinds of cases, it really does challenge this idea that perception is this passive reception of information. Sometimes when we're moving and exploring, we're changing the environment in ways that allow us to understand it better and more fully. Things that are kind of hidden until you reach out and explore, like weight or solidity and things like that.
Mm. And so, how do you think that that focus on, you mentioned the visual centrism of philosophy of
Mm.
mind, how do you think a focus on touch can reorient us when we think about the mind? Would you advise, for instance, a tactile centrism or moving away from a centrism of any sense?
Yeah, so no, down with all the centrisms. I yeah, so it's an interesting question, right? Because on the one hand, the field was so visual centric that there was just almost no work on touch, no work understanding what was unique about it and what was special about it. But I think the wrong lesson would be, oh, like now we should think of all perception as somewhat like touch. I think the senses are each individual and unique and have their own very interesting ways of doing things, their own structure, their own properties, their own feelings. And it's a mistake to try to generalize from what happens in one modality to another. And I think the arena for understanding this is in multisensory interactions. And one of the reasons why touch is so interesting is because it involves all of these different coordinated mechanisms for pressure and thermal awareness, but also for motor engagement and the experience of feedback that you get from actually acting and pressing on the world. And these things, this combination of kinesthesis and tactile reception makes touch um, m- more like a multisensory interaction than the passive visual case does. And so one of the things that I think is revealed by looking at touch as a kind of a starting point is just how deeply interactive the senses are. They're each unique, they each have their own things, but they're also not completely separate. They also coordinate and combine. And so the overall picture that we get of the senses is a really complex one. They have their individual elements, their own ways of doing things, but they also interact in interesting ways that also should be appreciated and taken on board when we're thinking about how to understand perception.
Yeah, and I like how you say down with all the centrisms, and I usually am down with that sentiment no matter the context. But I do want to put pressure on that idea for a minute, to use a tactile metaphor here.
Yeah, of course.
Because the title of your book is The First Sense. So there is a
Yeah.
sense of primacy and the privilege that you are
Mhm.
attributing to touch. And so if it is not that touch becomes the new model on which we think of the sensory field more generally, in what sense
Mm.
is touch first? Is it first evolutionarily? Is it first developmentally? Is it first in terms of ontological priority? So, can you say something about this tension that maybe I'm sensing between down with all the centrisms, but maybe recognizing that there is a firstness to touch?
Yeah, so it's a kind of provocative title and intended to be and to sort of reorient us away from vision as the primary arena for thinking about perception. And so um, it is the first developmentally. I think of it that way. It's the first in terms of um, uh, a kind of a basic form of awareness of reality itself. So it puts you in direct contact with the world in a way that has a kind of ontological priority. Unlike the other senses, which have a kind of distance between you and the world, it puts you into this first contact that has a lot of important things, I think, to reveal about our connection to the world through perception. And it also has um, a kind of interesting connection to bodily awareness and agency that is, I think, stronger than in the case of other sensory modalities. And one thing that happens in touch is you get like a hand centrism too, where when people talk about touch, they're really interested in like, your hands, but touch is distributed through your whole body. And we touch with our feet and with our backs and with the skin on our hair, like under on our scalp and in our lips and like all over our body. And so it's distributed in this way that is almost continuous with our sense of bodily self and our sense of agency. And it sort of defines the boundary between us and the world. And that role is very unique and not played by smell or hearing. And it sort of the sense of touch mediates the space we occupy as organisms in the world, as agents and beings. And I think in that sense, it does have a kind of priority that is, at least in the sense that it plays this unique role that the other senses don't.
It's so funny. We in the podcast episode on touch talk a lot about the hands because that's something that the phenomenologists discuss, Husserl and Merleau-Ponty and so
Mm.
on. So I'm feeling a bit convicted by that. But I want to think too about how, you mentioned in your work that touch is a really complex form of awareness, and that is something that you've also addressed in your answers so far. One of the things I really love about your work too is how many rich examples you use. And so even just now you
Mm.
mentioned the back and the scalp. And I think, David mentioned the key example earlier. So I think you bring up so many good examples to sort of illustrate touch as a complex form of awareness. And at the same time, you also argue in the book that it should be considered a single sense nonetheless. And so there's a unity to the sense of touch, even though it
Mm.
is complex. And that might lead you to think that it would be multiple. So tell us about this argument. Why should we still consider why should we still consider the sense of touch to be a unified or single sense?
Yeah. So the reason for that, I think, is because unlike a lot of philosophers who are working on these questions in a more traditional manner, I think of these questions as really arising within science and empirical studies. And so the question of taxonomy for me is a question in the philosophy of science about how we should divide up the kinds and the things that we study in science. And as a student and in my early work, I'm really inspired by work on complex interacting messy systems like in biology and in neuroscience. And in these domains, you get these kinds of interaction effects that can be decomposed in multiple legitimate ways, and you can focus on explanations at different levels and for different purposes. And so there's different ways of characterizing the phenomena that you're interested in and characterizing the things that matter relative to your explanations. And so one area in which this comes up for touch is thermal reception. So thermal reception, when you find out that things are hot or cold, there's a question of whether that's part of touch or whether it's a different form of awareness. And so I think there's multiple legitimate answers to that question. I think thermal awareness performs a homeostatic function, maintaining our thermal set level, so that if you start to get too cold, you start to shiver, or if you start to get too hot, you'll start to sweat. Thermal receptors play this role, and there's a kind of regulatory automatic function for those. And so it's part of this homeostatic system, not part of touch, right? It's part of this homeostatic system instead. It's not doing a perceptual thing, it's doing a regulatory thing. It also functions as part of the pain system. Like if you touch a hot pan, it'll burn your hand, and it like will create this immediate pain-like reaction. And that's not a perceptual kind of reaction. Some people think pain has a perceptual element, but it's also doing this protective function. It's really trying to keep us from hurting ourselves or injuring ourselves. But it also performs this perceptual function. And so it's giving us awareness of the thermal properties of objects in the environment. If I'm touching something metallic, it'll have a cold feel to it. So when I'm reaching into my bag to find the keys, the plastic things will feel warm, the wooden things will feel warm, but the metal things will feel cold. And that thermal awareness of the keys will help it pop out against the background, help me track it, help me know which thing it is, and help me know like what the object in the environment is. And so the claim that I generally make is that the sense of touch is unified and organized in part by exploratory action that connects all of these different elements towards a perceptual goal. So touch has motor control like kinesthesis and active engagement. It has a variety of different tactile sensors for pressure, for thermal awareness, for texture. And when these things get coordinated through activity, they function as a unit. They perform a single task. And so when we talk about haptic touch, or the sense of touch as we understand it, haptic touch just means active engaged touch that involves movement, as opposed to sometimes people call cutaneous touch or passive touch. When we're engaged in active haptic touch, all of these different things are working towards the same goal of extracting information about objects in our environment. And that is the reason why I think touch is unified, because it's got this single functional role that combines all of these things together and shows that it's doing one thing and not another. But all of these different elements can be doing double duty. They can do lots of different things. And in some contexts, it might be part of the pain network. In some contexts, it might be doing this regulation function. But when it's doing the active haptic touch stuff, that's when it's all coordinated in a way that I think qualifies it as a single sensory modality. It's a single way of extracting information from the world, distinct from the visual way of doing it, distinct from the auditory way of doing it, and in that sense, it has its own boundaries.
Mhm. Well, I mean, this question about whether it's single, it seems like it's connected to the question of whether it is in some way really distinct from other senses like vision
Hmm.
or olfaction, etc. And earlier you mentioned crossmodal perception, and there's a lot of really interesting research in perceiving under one modality through another set of sensory receptors or one kind
Right.
of I don't know if you can hear an ambulance going on in the
Oh
background.
yeah, it's
Okay.
loud, but it's all good.
Okay. Sorry. It's driving away. And okay. So you mentioned cross-modal perception, and I know
Yeah.
there is some research happening in the last like 15 years or so on using touch to create visual perceptions or
Yeah.
vision-like perceptions in subjects. Where, for
Yeah.
example, you mount a camera, and the camera is recording visual information, but then it's translating that information into tactile sensations that are delivered either to the abdomen or the back.
Yeah.
And over time, the subject that is using this technique or this machine,
That
sorry,
siren will not quit.
I
Okay.
know I am on a pathway for ambulances, apparently. And so there's this machine that will translate visual data that a camera is recording. It translates that into tactile little touches that are delivered
Yeah.
to the body of a research subject. Over time, initially, the subject just registers random touches on the skin. But over time, they start processing that as an image, and we say that they start seeing with the skin, which is really fascinating. And there have been a number of other research protocols
Mm.
that use different sensory modalities, also moving from one to the other. And so I'm wondering how that factors in to this account of the unity and separateness of the senses, given your earlier references to cross-modal perception.
Yeah, so I do think that there are pervasive interaction effects between vision and touch and all the sensory modalities, and so you're going to see lots of interesting overlap areas where visual information can alter, change, or enhance touch awareness and vice versa. And the tactile visual substitution systems, or the TVSS systems, are really fascinating because they show that a lot of the visual information about layout, distance, and relative closeness between objects can be effectively translated into a tactile domain. There are also raised tile drawings that the visually impaired can use to see distal layouts. And so that tactile information can be translated back and forth. And what's amazing is that the subjects, as you say, become so used to it and fluid with it that it almost becomes transparent, where they can, it's no longer merely a proximal form of awareness on the skin, but they can actually use it to
To
project out
navigate the
awareness of
space. Yeah.
to navigate, to see what's going on in the environment. And so I think that what this shows is that there are some kinds of information, in particular spatial information, that is intertranslatable between modalities. And so in the voice system, which uses auditory signals to translate distances for visually impaired subjects, similar kind of thing. The auditory things can capture distances and spatial relations in ways that can be learned and picked up on. And so I think that is, historically, this is like a notion of so-called common sensibles, this idea that the sensory
Mm.
modalities share some set of sensible properties that they can translate between them, and that subjects can learn to use one or the other interchangeably. And so in touch, there's a bunch of famous questions about whether vision can translate to touch and back and forth. And I think that that is what's going on in these cases. But I also think it's limited in interesting ways. So TVSS systems don't generally do a good job of conveying color information or
Mm.
texture information. And the resolution is very different from the resolution that you get in touch. And so while it's amazing that there are these common areas of overlap, there are also interesting areas where there seem like there are proper sensibles, where the modalities are doing something that no other modality can do. And, for vision, that's generally thought to be something like color. Touch doesn't really seem to have a proper sensible in that sense. It has thermal awareness, which is kind of unique to it, and some other things like solidity, perhaps, or certain kinds of weight, mass of something. But those, some people think, well, you can see how heavy something looks, and so on, or you can see how hot something looks, and so there's a limited range of properties that each of the modalities is more sensitive to, and that is something that is different, even though in all these other remarkable cases there's all this information transfer that can go back and forth between the modalities.
Yeah, and I mean, I just wonder whether those common sensibles would then be something like maybe time and space. We've talked about space and spatial features, maybe
Yeah,
also time. It would be interesting to see what are those
right.
things that all the senses in some way can register through their own pathways, versus the sorts of things that only register to some senses rather than the
Right.
others.
I think that's right. What's super interesting to me is that the ones that are shared and that overlap, even though they're shared and overlap, the senses provide their own unique way of doing things. And so when you get in these multisensory contexts, you get this interaction effect that doesn't tell you that vision is right, and it doesn't tell you that touch is right. It kind of averages them out in a way that produces an intermediate multisensory percept that is like the best guess of the average between the two. And because you've got this average, the idea is like each modality is giving you its own independent estimate of what's going on. And I always like to think of this as like a kind of almost like the senses are giving you a vote. It's like touch is saying, I think the texture is this, and vision saying, no, I think it's this. And then you sort of ask the modalities, like, how sure are you? Are you really sure? And in cases where vision is really sure, like the lighting's really good, you got like a good perspective,
Yeah, yeah.
vision will dominate, and it'll be more like the visual case. And there's all these really famous multisensory illusions that occur,
Yeah.
like the ventriloquist effect and so on, that occur when the modalities disagree, and they occur for touch too. And it's super interesting the ways in which the different modalities try to reconcile their disagreements, so that subjects aren't, you were never confused about like which sense to believe, because they automatically kind of average things out in a way that the world seems coherent and consistent and coordinated. And there's just so much going on under the hood. For anytime you touch something or and look at it at the same time, these things are feedback on each other and coordinated in a way that we almost are never aware of. But it's really fascinating and interesting to think about.
Yeah, and that kind of also takes me back to your point about the centrism earlier. It's almost as if our bodies know that there isn't one kind of central sense, but there are these different contexts in which one or the other
Yeah.
sense is going to rise to the fore, and they're really in mutual interaction. So I want to ask you, Matt, about an aspect of your work that David and I found fascinating, which is this idea of whether or not touch requires direct contact with what we are touching. You point out in your
Mm.
work that it's really common to think of touch as requiring direct contact between one's body and the thing that one is touching. But you argue that this isn't always the case, so that we can actually touch things that are at a distance from the apparent limits of our bodies.
Right.
And you say that this is an experience of distal touch. So, can you
Mhm.
give us an example of this, or give an example to our listeners? And fun fact, too, for our I should say viewers rather than listeners, but for our viewers, we discussed this a little bit as well in our podcast episode on touch. But now we get to hear it from Matt Fulkerson
So, yeah,
himself.
there we disagreed. Now we get it from the mouth of the expert.
No, we no, we laid it out. Tell us, yeah, give us an example of distal touch and explain how is it possible that we can touch things that are not in direct contact with our bodies?
Yeah, so this is going to get back to the question about the sensory substitution systems in a way, because there's a sense in which what happens at the proximate contact points of the body, we can kind of project outward into the world. And one of the ways that we can do that is through the use of tools and intermediaries. So I think once we start thinking about distal touch, we can just like, there's so many examples that are vivid and interesting. So from walking sticks, using tongs to cook. The one that I always love is, and this still happens to me to this day, is when I'm on a bed and there's a cat that's walking along the bed, and you can kind of feel where the cat is through touch. You can feel it as it's moving around on the other parts of the bed. You can
Mm.
feel its feet as it's going down. You can feel where it's moving. You can track it. You can recognize it, and all of those things. And this always happens when tools or intermediaries sort of expand into what I call peripersonal space, into the area around the body in which you can actively engage. And these tools expand the distance at which we can interact with the world. And one of the areas where this happens the most often is when you're driving a car. The car is an intermediary rigid structure with wheels that have springs as well, that translates information from the world, from the road, up through the structure of the vehicle into your hands, into your seat, and you can feel changes in texture, orientation. You can feel when you're turning onto a dirt road, and onto like a bump or some kind of like object that you shouldn't have driven over, like a bag of nails or something like that. You can feel it when you're hitting those things, and you feel, and it I think, we forget that we're aware of that, but that we're aware of that through touch. It's our sense of touch that's mediating these kinds of distal awareness, because there's no other. I mean, sometimes you can hear the sound of things, and touch and audition are going to interact in lots of these cases. But in lots of the cases with walking sticks, or in the use of a tool, or when driving a car, it's the sense of touch, and not through your hands in the case of a car. That's why I like that example. It maybe through the steering wheel a little bit, but it's your whole body, your whole entire body moving and vibrating and feeling the pressure and feeling the changes. And it projects outward, not to their body, but outward to where the the object or the intermediary tool is connecting with the world. And so I do think that it's constrained. You can't have distal touch like just goes out to anywhere. What has to happen is that the tools or intermediaries that you use have to reliably and accurately transmit information from the endpoint to your body. And because you're actively moving and engaging and in control of these tools, they're not mere passive conduits of information. You're moving the walking stick, you're turning the steering wheel, you're in control of where the car goes and how it moves. Because you're in control and exploring the world essentially, with this feedback, then you're able to project out that information to the endpoints of the tool and get that information about the texture or the shape. And again, just like with TVSS, it's constrained. Generally, the tools are going to tell you where something's located, maybe how big it is, a rough outline of its shape, texture. If you're sliding it along like a stick along the ground, it'll tell you like what the road composition is. But it's not going to give you all of the information that you're going to get from grasping something in your hand and actually feeling it. You're not going to get thermal properties, for instance. You're not going to know how hot or cold it is.
Okay, it is so funny you say that because when we were thinking about this, in fact, this was something that you brought up, David. And so we
Yeah.
said that we would ask you about this because David was concerned that distal touch might not be a case of touch because you couldn't get the thermal properties of the road or other properties. But I think you've already just provided an
Yes.
answer, which is I know that, and I still think it's touch.
Well, so there are some cases. So there are examples of distal touch that I talk about using fingernails and gloves, very thin gloves, feeling the floor through your socks. Like these are cases where you could get thermal information about whether the floor is cold in the morning through
I
some
get that
socks or
information way
slippers.
too often. I have
Right.
chronically cold feet.
Right. And so I think we forget that, like, socks are a kind of barrier, an intermediary between our skin and the world, and the information is being transmitted through it. Our clothing, even you can feel cold breeze coming through your clothing. Um, and so, we think of distal touch as, having to be some like multiple feet away or some far distance. But the general principles just are that whatever the distal information is, it's being reliably transmitted to the surface of our body, and our body is then able to take on that information and figure out what's going on in the world. And sometimes, the barriers are very thin, really thin gloves or really thin small items that would allow for some thermal information, but very often they're not. And so, what you can experience distally through touch depends very much on the tool that you're using and how much exploratory control you have over it. So, I mentioned in the book, I think, if you have a string, you can hold the string and you can like move it all around a room. You're going to get very little information about what's going on in the room because you're not getting reliable feedback. You're not getting
Mhm.
the ability to press against things and see if they're solid or get vibration or any of the other pieces of information. So you might have a tool and it might be really long that you can use like in various ways to explore the room, but it's not the right kind to give you the kind of awareness that you need.
Yeah, it seems like it needs to be a solid tool that is in contiguous contact with you and the
Yeah.
world. Would that
Yeah.
be true of your theory of distal touch? That absent that, you cannot really get that.
I think that's the ideal case, but I do think there are cases like feeling somebody through, like a puppy through a blanket, or
Okay.
the cat on the bed, or through gloves, where like a soft
Okay.
object. So that category, I think I call it something like palpation, or there are other kinds of enclosures where you can feel a solid object under some soft intermediary or through some kind of intervening a barrier that isn't rigid in structure and couldn't be used for texture, but could still give you useful information through touch.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, Matthew, this has been a wonderful discussion about touch. We thank you for your time.
Yes, it's such an honor to have you join us. We're really
Yeah.
grateful for your taking the time to talk with us, and we know you viewers are probably grateful as well, given how wonderful this interview has been.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I had a lot of fun.
Great. All right, take care and see you all soon. Thanks.